We are good to go. So welcome to the session on transparency reporting for beginners. I don't know if we could maybe get a show of hands. How many beginners are there in the audience with regards to transparency reporting? One, two, oh, we have lots of beginners. What's a beginner? I don't know. I think we maybe can try to answer that on the panel today. My name is Catherine Marr. I am from Access, and I have an incredible panel that I've been asked to moderate today, and I'm really just here to try to keep the conversation going with all these experts. We have Ryan Budish from the Harvard Berkman Center for Internet and Society, who is an expert on transparency reporting and will sort of give us an overview of the lay of the land. We have Ali Kazemi from Tumblr, who is here to talk a little bit about your recent forays into transparency reporting. We have Becky Vons, who's here from Credo. Credo Mobile is the first mobile network operator to actually issue a transparency report, beating out the big guys just earlier this year. We have Bart Volkmer from Dropbox, who's here to speak a little bit about their experiences. I think Dropbox is one of the very first companies to actually issue a set of principles on how they respond to requests. We have Dorothy Chu from Google. Google is the first company to issue a transparency report back in 2010 and has a sort of 5 different areas that they report on. And then we have Kevin Bankson from the Open Technology Institute, but who recently was Tech Policy Director at the Open Technology Institute, but recently in his role at the Center for Democracy and Technology was one of the organizers of the We Need to Know Coalition, which pushed for more aggressive transparency reporting permissions in the aftermath of the NSA surveillance disclosures. So with that, I will turn it over to Ryan, who's going to introduce everything else for us.
Great, thank you. Just out of curiosity, how many people are here because they're interested in transparency reporting, as in they want to get started, releasing them for whatever company that they're a part of, versus how many of you here are more interested because you're activists and you want to sort of understand more about how you can use transparency reporting? So the first one, companies. Okay, a few hands. And users on the consumer side? Okay, great. So as Catherine said, transparency reporting is sort of a newer phenomenon, really starting with Google in 2010. And what we've seen over the past several years is that what started as a trickle has really exploded, particularly over the past 12 months, and now includes many of the great people that I'm happy to share the stage with. And actually the momentum, it's easy to sort of think that Snowden was what pushed companies into doing this. But certainly several of the companies who are up here with us today started before the Snowden revelations, and actually, if you look, many of the companies that started releasing them actually released just prior to those revelations. So this is actually a bigger phenomenon, and a very important one. And one that isn't just about national security requests. And when you look at the data, although limited in what we know, what we can pull out from the data is that the national security requests are just one piece and aren't even the predominant piece. So it's important to keep in mind that that companies are facing a lot of demands from governments, not just the U.S. government, and a lot of those demands are criminal investigations, whether they be drug crimes or pornography issues or anything like that. So you don't from a creator perspective, you shouldn't be thinking just about transparency reporting only if you think you're going to be a target of the NSA or the FBI. You really should be thinking about transparency reporting if you're collecting any kind of information, because it might be the sheriff's office down the street doing an arson investigation that comes to you, or it might be the NSA. And so really, that's an important piece of perspective to have. And so I'm from the Berkman Center at Harvard, and we've been looking at transparency reporting for a while now, and we've talked with a lot of companies about why they've released transparency reports and what they've included in them and how they made those decisions. And I just wanted to sort of flag a few things that we've learned that I think are important to keep in mind. The first one is that we're now up to, and my number could be wrong, I think 18 companies have released transparency reports. So that's a really terrific number. And they all have very different reasons for why they've done it. And I'm sure we'll hear from some of them in the next few minutes. But in talking to a lot of them, some of the things that we've learned is that many have done it for the reason that, you know, receiving these requests from governments put companies in a hard spot. If the U.S. government comes to you with a warrant, even if you disagree with it, there's very little that you can do. And so a transparency report is one way to respond when your hands are tied in so many other ways. And so that's why many start off doing transparency reports. But as they start doing it, what we've heard from them is that it actually improves the way that they handle government requests. That the very act of knowing that you're going to be making this information public it improves the efficiency of how you collect the reports, how you respond to them. Many companies have actually built custom tools for keeping track of the government requests that come in, and they found that to be incredibly helpful. Many companies have found this to be a way to differentiate themselves from their competitors. And in fact, what we've seen over the past 6 months to a year is that there's been quite a bit of innovation and competition in what companies are deciding to include in their transparency reports. Whether it be warrant canary, which is something that Apple included in their report. Credo did a great job of pretty much listing individual requests, which is a way that they were able to make their reports stand out. And so there's really been a great opportunity for companies to try to innovate and differentiate themselves in that. In that space. They also, we've also heard from companies that it's something that releasing transparency reports is something that their employees care about, that employees get excited about, and they view it as something positive that their company is doing. And increasingly, I think investors are caring about this, which then further helps companies get behind the idea. But I think there's also some challenges with transparency reporting. One of which that we've heard is that there's issues of context, a lack of context and understanding. That it's easy for particularly journalists to open up a transparency report, pick out the biggest number, and just say, "Oh my God, this company turned over, 100 pieces of user data or 10,000 pieces of user data," when the real questions or the more important questions, are very hard to put into transparency reports. So the questions about process. How did you review those requests? How did you make the decisions about which ones should be responded to versus which ones shouldn't? And so, that's one of the big challenges right now with transparency reporting, and there haven't been a lot of good answers yet into how to communicate more of a story in transparency reporting without, while at the same time, without divulging too much information or giving sort of the recipe for how to evade the company's attempts to block certain kinds of demands for user data by saying, well, if you do X, Y, and Z, we'll have no choice but to respond. So companies don't want to sort of give away that information, which is understandable. But on the flip side, from the user side, transparency reports, and I think Kevin will get into this a little bit, they have a mess of definitions right now, even just in the way that they define certain legal terms. Court order, for instance, can have a bunch of stuff packed into it. And so from an activist perspective or an academic's perspective, it can be really hard to sort through what exactly transparency reports mean. So anyway, those are some of the things that we've been working on and that we've been thinking about. And I look forward to talking more about it with you guys.
Cool. So, hi, I'm Kevin. And I'm going to take us on a quick whirlwind tour of the last year of national security reporting before we go on to hear the individual perspectives of the various company representatives that we have here. Last year on this day, no one was or was able to report on the national security requests they got, either national security letters issued by an FBI agent or court orders from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court under FISA. Now, a year later, I can't publish a memo on this topic today without it being outdated this afternoon because Verizon just issued FISA numbers today. But today, if you Google for the OTI blog, you will find this new memo that we did with this handy-dandy chart breaking down how all the different companies who are reporting categorize all the different types of legal process they receive and which ones they report and which ones they don't. And you'll see that many of them now do publishing on national security requests. And you might think that started with Ed Snowden, but it didn't. It actually started this Wednesday 1 year ago, when Google became the first company to publish numbers about the national security letters it receives. These NSLs come with a gag order. The statute says if you get these letters, you can never talk about them. But Google had engaged in a negotiation with the Justice Department to get permission to publish numbers of national security letters in ranges of 1,000. They could say, we've received 0 to 999 or 1,000 to 1999 of these letters, and the number of users or accounts affected. Probably not coincidentally, Microsoft, just a couple of weeks later, issued its first, their site is screwed up, but issued its first transparency report ever, and it too included this negotiated NSL deal. And the thing that we've learned from this, which is why I think these companies sought this permission and why the DOJ was willing to give it, they did not actually get that many NSLs. Google, for example, received less than 1,000 NSLs that year. But that same month, between those two releases, we saw this. The Electronic Frontier Foundation had a victory in this district, the Northern District of California, where Judge Ilston found that the gag order that accompanies NSLs was unconstitutional. That decision is on appeal right now, but I think the questionable legality of the gag orders that surround this process is an important overhanging atmospheric on this whole issue. But so this didn't, and so then things were quiet for a little while on this issue. We didn't have any other companies publishing these types of numbers. But then, let's see, yeah, there we go, boom goes the dynamite, Edward Snowden, and the PRISM reporting, some might say misreporting, about how the NSA had direct access into a wide variety of companies' servers. And then suddenly, you have all of these companies, some who have been issuing transparency reports before, some who had been poo-pooing the idea, at all, such as Facebook, which just the month before its Stockholm Internet Forum had said, we don't really want to publish a transparency report, we think it will cause a race to the bottom, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, you suddenly had all these companies on the PRISM slide saying, we would love to tell you more about what's going on, but we can't, we need more transparency. So, very quickly, some might say, in a panic, a number of the companies, and I forgot to put the link for this, a number of the companies negotiated a new deal with the DOJ. Microsoft, Facebook, Apple, and Yahoo all negotiated permission from the DOJ to publish a new type of number. The one bucket number is what I'll call it. A number of all the law enforcement requests and all the FISA orders and all the national security letters that the company has received and the number of people affected by them, all in ranges of 1,000, such that you basically got a really kind of worthless number of every piece of paper these companies got and the number of people that were affected by it. Google and Twitter called this a step back because Google and Twitter, and at that point Microsoft, before it made this deal, had been breaking out law enforcement requests in the wide variety of them and national security letters into separate numbers. And now you had these other companies saying, well, our version of transparency is one single number for every piece of process, whether it's for content or not for content, whether it's FISA or law enforcement, whether it's a real-time wiretap or access to stored data, one number, just because we're trying to disprove this allegation that we've given untrammeled access to all our stuff. Around the same time, actually within a week of that announcement, Google went to the FISA court to challenge the gag orders on it when it came to talking about FISA orders. Microsoft soon followed, then so did Facebook, Yahoo, and Dropbox. LinkedIn joined in as an amicus, as did a group of free speech organizations, including the organization I worked at the time, the Center for Democracy and Technology. It was around this time that at CDT, we called a meeting of several of the key companies and civil society groups to start talking about whether we could stop the fussing and the feuding and maybe come up with a single position on where we were on transparency, what we wanted from both the administration and from Congress on that. And what we arrived at was something that has come to be called the We Need to Know Coalition, which issued a letter in mid-July with the strongest statement in support of transparency that we had yet seen from any of these companies individually or separately. And what that group asked for specifically from Congress and from the administration was permission for the companies to publish the specific number of requests they received under every specific legal authority, not just different types of law enforcement and NSLs and FISA, but also the different types of FISA orders, like the 215 orders that you've heard about for records, or the 702 mass wiretaps, or this or that and the other, and the specific number of people affected. And this got results. Pretty quickly, we had bicameral, bipartisan legislation getting introduced in the House and the Senate, Franken and friends on the Senate side, Lofgren and friends on the House side, mostly responsive to what we'd asked for, and quickly munched together and rolled into the USA Freedom Act, which is now the leading piece of reform legislation. Meanwhile, the FISA briefing continued in the court challenge. And for a while, there was a big delay in the briefing while the government and the companies negotiated. Delay, 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 until finally it said, okay, we haven't reached a deal. The companies file one new combined mega request, all on the same page, saying this is what we want, consistent with what we said in the letter that we wanted. And things slowed down a bit, except there was a hearing on the Franken bill in the Senate Judiciary Committee. Where did it? I did not put the link for that. But so I had a picture from the hearing. Google testified, Richard Salgado from Google, who's here today. I testified on behalf of the We Need to Know Coalition in my last official act at CDT. The next week, as my first official act at OTI, I published a blog post about the hearing and really calling to task the telephone companies, who had been nowhere on the surveillance issue, not even on transparency, much less substance. But and we're facing a lot of pressure, I think, both because the internet companies were now really stepping up, especially on transparency. There were also now starting to be attempts at shareholder resolutions to make the companies publish. And so finally, we heard the news that on December 19th, that Verizon was going to issue a transparency report. Going to be the first one to issue a transparency report. The next day, AT&T says, we're going to do it too. But they both got scooped by Credo, which on January 8th published the first transparency report from a phone company, and actually did it in a really unique way that I think is a good idea for smaller companies, which is they individually listed each of the 18 requests they received over that year. And so Verizon issued its transparency report. It included the ranged FISA, no NSL numbers, but didn't include FISA numbers. We're still waiting on the FISA court decision. And then we get a big announcement, January 27th, there's a deal. The case is settled. Well, it's not technically a settlement, but rather, in exchange for the DOJ agreeing to this I'll explain, the companies decided to voluntarily dismiss their case in the FISA court. And what the DOJ agreed to was, whether you're one of the companies that brought the case or any other company, we will allow you to do 2-bucket reporting on national security requests. You can give a ranged number of NSLs and a ranged number of all the FISA orders you get. And there are basically 2 flavors of this. You could either break it out in ranges of 1,000 and also be able to break out which of those had to do with content of communications and which of those had to do with non-content. Or you can do it in ranges of 250, a good option for smaller companies, but you don't get to break out whether it was content or non-content. Very quickly, all the companies rushed out numbers consistent with this agreement, except for Twitter, who said this was a bad deal and rattled their saber about the possibility of a lawsuit, presumably here in the Northern District of California, which I think would be a bang-up idea. And then AT&T quickly releases its report highlighting the reason why this was not a great deal, or one of the reasons, which is we all know that AT&T gets these bulk orders for everybody's data. And yet, according to AT&T's report, it received less than 1,000 FISA orders affecting less than 1,000 people. And this didn't make much sense until you looked very closely at the language of the agreement, and it said, well, for NSLs, you can say the number of people affected, the number of accounts affected, which would, I think, cover everyone whose data was handed over. For FISA orders, you can only say the number of targets specified in the order, such that if you received a bulk untargeted order, that would count 0. So really, ironically, the main thing that we need reports to fill the trust gap on, which is assuring us that bulk data is not being handed over, this deal does not allow that level of transparency, which is a crying shame. What's next? I've already taken too much time, so we can talk about what's next in questions. In the meantime, I'm going to man the computer while these fine people talk about their transparency reports. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. I think the idea is actually to go over to the granddaddy of transparency reporting in Google and hear a little bit about Google's perspective on being the very first company to issue one of these reports. Let's start with
So I guess I can give a brief overview of how we started doing transparency reports, what gave us the idea in the first place, and how it all came together. 2010 was a particularly interesting year for us. I think we announced our decision to stop censoring in China that year. For us, that was the first time that we were really seeing just how much attention was being drawn to that issue. And in the process, we got lots of different inquiries from governments and journalists alike, and they were all saying, you know, actually just focusing a lot on China and all the censorship and surveillance that was going on there. And a lot of us started looking at these questions and saying, you know, actually, these questions should probably be asked of other countries as well. It's not just China that's an issue. And so as we were analyzing that, and we were talking to people in Congress as well as civil society groups like the ones Kevin was a part of and journalists, we realized that we really needed to add numbers to provide context for the things that we were saying. So a lot of the free expression arguments or a lot of the lawful access arguments that we were making were really, we felt weaker without the numbers. And so we were thinking, what are different ways that we can actually add data and context to the situation that we're facing so people understand what laws are actually in place and what causes these things to happen, like content removals and censorship or surveillance. And so that's when we decided, let's try to collate manually all the requests that we received to remove information from our services, as well as the number of requests that we get to hand over user data to different governments. And so that's when we started reporting. I think the first set was data from July to December 2009, reported in April 2010. And at the same time, we had been working with several engineers on making sure that when different services of ours went down in different countries or became inaccessible, we wanted to be able to show that to the world as well. And so we actually launched that feature in September of that year. And that's when we actually had the big official transparency report launch, I would say, is September 2010 with those two features. And from then on out, we've been updating those numbers and government requests every 6 months, and our traffic report is in real time. And I would say, we've launched several other features as well since then. One having to do with copyright, another one having to do with safe browsing. And our goal for all of this is really to show people how government actions and how different kinds of laws and policies are actually affecting them on the ground, and giving them the ability to use this data to fight for better policies, fight for better laws, and ask for reform when they need to. So yeah, that was the basic, I think, premise behind why we started doing transparency reporting.
Thank you. And I know that we want to get to the questions, but I also want to hear from everybody else in the panelists to have their experiences in getting to this point. Perhaps, Bart, you could tell us a little bit about Dropbox's experience and what brought you.
Sure. I can give you a little bit of the history on Dropbox's transparency reporting efforts, and then talk a little bit about what our philosophy is right now and sort of how that's changed over time. We first published in the summer of 2012. We thought it'd be a good thing to do. Generally, it was a very no-frills report. We just put out the number of requests received and the number of accounts that were affected, by the percentage of accounts that were affected by those requests. And then we put out another report around this time last year, and then we just recently published our third transparency report. And as we've evolved in our thinking on this, and we've received more requests, we're really focusing on 3 or 4 main areas. And the first one, I think, is granularity around the types of requests we were getting. In the early days of our reporting, we just sort of said, here's law enforcement requests, here's the number of accounts affected. And now we're really breaking down warrants, subpoenas, and then to the extent we can, national security requests. So we think that principle is important to really get granular on the types of requests, and then specificity around how we responded. And I think that there's varying degrees of specificity provided in different reports from different companies. We just think, let's just be upfront and transparent exactly how we responded on this stuff, and we'll let the chips fall where they may on this. People might not like our response rate, or they might not like exactly the numbers they're seeing, but we think if we can just give the information to people, they can slice and dice it however they want. So we want to provide, do we provide notice? How many times do we provide notice? When do we provide content? When do we not provide content? And just really break down the numbers and just get them out there. So that's, I think, our second principle. And really the third principle is just to incorporate our transparency, our government request principles. So we have 4 principles that we recently announced where we tell users, hey, here's how we're going to handle this. Here's our philosophy on this stuff. And we've now incorporated those principles into our privacy policy. And I think it's really important that people understand what we're thinking when we get these requests and we process them. So those are kind of the high level thinking of Dropbox right now. National security requests are sort of an ongoing debate. We'd like to be able to disclose the precise number of national security requests we receive, if any. That has not been allowed to date. We've made commitments to keep fighting for that principle because we believe strongly that specificity is really important on stuff like this.
Ali, I know that Tumblr just released for the very first time your first transparency report in February. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the experience.
Sure.
Before you guys, just let me say, it's gorgeous. Take a look at it. It's apropos for the company. They have all these really nice, let's see.
So that was nice by our designer. I had nothing to do with that part of it, unfortunately.
Very pretty graphs.
So when I arrived at Tumblr in 2012, we had seen an uptick in law enforcement-related requests for user data. So we immediately had to revise and improve our ability to analyze and respond to these requests we were receiving. And around the same time, we decided we should publish a transparency report, sort of following the lead of Google and Twitter, but we also wanted to add a Tumblr voice to our report. We weighed a lot of different factors in deciding what to go into our report, but I think primarily there were 4 things we were looking at. 1, what do we want to accomplish by publishing a transparency report? 2, what data should we actually track and analyze for the report, and how are we going to do that? 3, what's the best way to present it? And that's sort of what Kevin has up on the big screen. But there was a lot of thought that went into the best way to present the data that we were collecting and analyzing. And then finally, were there ways that we could push the envelope on transparency reporting? So just briefly, I wanted to go through those 4 points. As far as what we wanted to accomplish, we've always felt like we were a safe, open, and transparent platform for our users. And consistent with those principles, we wanted that to come out in our transparency report. We also wanted to highlight a few key issues that are somewhat unique to Tumblr, but are also shared by a lot of the other companies that are on this panel right now. No content without a warrant. So there's some debate about whether you can get content through a subpoena. At Tumblr, we clearly require a warrant for any content. User notice, we try to give it anytime we can. We carved out 1 or 2 exceptions in our policies where we do not give user notice in cases where we receive law enforcement requests for data. But generally, we're always going to try to provide user notice to targets of investigations. And the third one was Tumblr's position on national security requests. I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. Don't worry, it's not that long. Just like 5 minutes from now, I'll get into that. So those were the main objectives we had with publishing our first transparency report. The next big question was process. How are we going to get it all done? So early on, we agreed on the types of data that we would track through calendar year 2013. A lot of them are similar to what Bar just mentioned. Who issued the request? Was it state, federal, local, or international law enforcement? What form did it take? Was it a subpoena, a warrant, a court order, some sloppy email from a local sheriff? We wanted to get all of that in the transparency report. What kind of case was it? We sort of pushed the envelope there a little bit. I'll talk about that when we get to user notice, but we actually broke out the requests we received in the user notice context by type of investigation. So harassment, privacy, national security, violent crimes, child pornography. We wanted to make that clear and get as granular as we could without violating any NDOs, either directly or indirectly. If we complied with a request, did we provide content or data? And did we provide user notice? So this was our first shot at a transparency report, so we were building this all from scratch. We had to train our 10-person trust and safety team in how to review and evaluate the law enforcement requests that we were receiving. And we're a pretty small legal shop. There's only 2 lawyers and 10 TNS people, and the TNS team handles not just law enforcement, but also copyright, trademark, free speech, harassment, privacy. So it was a big challenge for us, but ultimately we came up with a system that worked, we think. And by the end of 2013, we had the data that we needed. So the next challenge was presentation. What we decided up front is we didn't care about you people, like the activists, the lawyers, the people who are really interested in the sector. We didn't care about pleasing you. Well, maybe a little bit, but mostly we were targeting lay people, our average users. We wanted to make the report accessible to anybody who might come across it. So your grandparents, your kids, just someone who's surfing the web and comes across Tumblr's transparency report and might be vaguely interested in learning about it. So we wrote the report accordingly. We stripped out a lot of the legalese. We stripped out as many of the legal citations to statutes and case law that we could within reason. We wrote it in a very conversational tone, and as Kevin pointed out, we had a crack designer come up with really cool charts and graphs to turn my very boring statistics into something that would be actually kind of pleasurable to look at. I think it made a huge difference as far as getting more people to read the report and hopefully understand it. And then finally, on pushing the envelope, we wanted to push the envelope on transparency. We know there are a lot of reports out there, but Tumblr's a small shop. We're a little bit less risk averse than some other people in the sector. So we did a couple of things. One of the things we did is, as I mentioned, we reported on notice per category of investigation, and we'd love to see other companies do that if they can. Granted, we had smaller volume than the Googles and the Facebooks, but we also had a smaller legal team. So we were able to make it happen. We were very proud of that. The other thing we did is, on the national security front, we went ahead and included 2 warrant canaries, one on NSLs and one on FISA orders. I know it's a bit of a sensitive topic right now, but we felt like we were on firm legal footing, and without compromising attorney-client privilege, we did discuss the issue, and we were comfortable publishing the 2 warrant canaries. which just said Tumblr has never received an NSL or a FISA order in calendar year 2013. So that's another area where we're hoping to challenge and maybe push some other people in the sector to do the same thing. And I'm happy to talk to anybody who's thinking about it to give any our thoughts or even some legal advice. So that was our first transparency report. It was a great learning experience. Our entire company took a lot of pride in the final product. We were very happy with it, and we were also just really happy to be joining this field with a lot of really impressive companies who've been doing it for a long time.
I should note that for those of you who are not familiar with the idea of a warrant canary, the idea is that as long as the company continues to publish that they have not received a request, they have not received a request. When they stop publishing that they have not received a request, you may be able to assume that a request has been received. Very clever. Sneaky. Very sneaky. Becky, you guys published the very first telco mobile network operator transparency
I might
report,
jump down and trade places with Kevin just so I can see the slides up the button.
which is, I think, grounds for a round of applause for you guys, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about?
I don't think your slides are up.
Oh, perfect. You have any clicker? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so my name is Becky Bond, and I'm Vice President and Political Director at Credo Mobile. Okay, that's fine. So the first thing I want to say is, first of all, it's so great to be part of this group of these people that are doing something really big, publishing this transparency reports. But I do want to provide a little context, because at Credo, we don't just run a mobile telephone company, but we're also activists. So I want to acknowledge that in the face of the mass surveillance that we are facing in this country, that it is a pretty sad state of affairs that is considered a big and bold step to be issuing these transparency reports. So I want to sort of give a little bit about the context. What may be considered legal under the Obama administration's astonishingly aggressive interpretation of the Patriot Act, we think much of this may be declared unconstitutional by the courts eventually. So we think it's really important how we act as companies today on behalf of our customers, but also on behalf of citizens of the United States, to be as aggressive as possible within the law in order to advocate for privacy. And the first step is becoming educated. And those of you who work for companies and those of us, there's a lot that we can actually do. And transparency reports is just one part of that, but I just want to go over a few things. One, and several people talk about that, informing your customers. A lot of companies don't inform their customers when they hand over information over warrants. Almost any company, to almost any request, can and should inform the customers within a reasonable amount of time, so that even if you're not going to fight against this request for information, they can. It's really important. Do only what's required by law. There is a ton of volunteerism that's going on with companies handing over private information, data, or content to the government, and what a lot of these folks are saying here is sort of know what's required. You talk about what requires a warrant and what doesn't. Just because the government asks for it, gives you a piece of paper, you need to be informed and make sure that you don't turn things over that you don't have to. Challenge the legalities of NSLs, national security letters. There are ways that companies can challenge these requests, especially requests where you can't inform the customer. So since they can't fight it, it's up to companies to do so. Challenging orders before the FISA court. These are things that companies can do and need to do on behalf of their customers. So this is part of the context in which these transparency reports fall. If you don't know what to do, you can call the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the ACLU, Center for Constitutional Rights, and ask them for advice. Okay, companies don't have to feel like they have to have a huge legal department to be able to get informed and fight these things. There are calories out there waiting, and they can help you. Okay, and speak out against laws like the Patriot Act. So we're very proud of our transparency report at Credo, but we're more proud of the fact that we advocate for full repeal of the Patriot Act and full repeal of the FISA Amendments Act. I want to be clear about that. And finally, companies can't hand over data that doesn't exist. So it's really important for companies not to store data that they don't need. So this is the context within which we put out our first transparency report, which we're incredibly proud of as a company. And I want to show this. One of the things that we said at the first line of our transparency report reads, Credo has a long history of defending civil liberties and fighting against abuses of power that threaten Americans' constitutional rights to privacy. We are working for full repeal of the USA Patriot Act and FISA Amendments Act. We can use these transparency reports to advocate for the change that we want, not just for our customers, but for all U.S. citizens. So I think it's really important to note that about how we introduced our privacy report, our transparency report. We make very clear up front, it is our policy to notify our customers whenever allowed by law of the existence of a governmental request for that information. Very few companies do that. Companies that do should be applauded for that. Companies that don't, as advocates and customers, we should demand that they let their customers know when they handle the information to the government. I also want to say that in our transparency report we wrote, it is important to note that it may not be possible for Credo or any telecom carrier to release to the public a full transparency report, as the USA Patriot Act and other statutes give law enforcement the ability to prevent companies from disclosing whether or not they have received certain orders, such as national security letters and Section 215 orders seeking customer information. I think that every time we talk about what's in a transparency report, we have to talk about what the government does not allow companies to do, even though through the courts is moving challenges, and national security letters and the gag orders have been declared unconstitutional. Another thing that we did is we really wanted to set a standard, okay? So not only did we put the type of request, we put the requesting agency was somewhere all customer information provided and where that was. Because we think that we need to report at the most granular level and set standards for other telecoms to do so. Now, you may say that we're smaller than other telecoms, and certainly Credo Mobile is smaller than other telecoms, but if you've ever looked at your mobile phone bill, I mean, a lot of people probably just pay it online, but who's looked at their mobile phone bill recently? Okay. It's an astonishing amount of data, right, that is in your mobile phone bill in terms of who you've called or who you've texted. There is no reason why these giant telecoms cannot report at this level of specificity on every single request that they get. So we can find out where the abuses of power are coming from, whether it's the Department of Homeland Security or whether it's a certain sheriff's agency in one county in one state. And finally, I want to say that one of the things that Credo has done is over the course of our time as a business is that we fund the American Civil Liberties Union, we fund the Center for Constitutional Rights, we fund the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and the American Booksellers Foundation for Free Expression. And so not only are we presenting a transparency report, but we also want to be very clear. There's lots of corporate giving. Companies give away a lot of money, whether it's through the United Way or any other thing. But that companies who are committed to privacy and committed to bringing down the surveillance state, one of the things we can do is not just share our transparency report, but we need to share the fruits of our businesses, and we need to support the organizations that are out there that are fighting for the rights of our customers, and that are fighting for the rights of ourselves as citizens. And so we think that it's very important for companies not just to take a stand on what they do, but to support the organizations that are out there fighting mass surveillance. And again, feel free to contact me by email if you want to talk at all about how we came to submitting our transparency report. If you have ideas, one of the things we're doing is we're going to be putting them out quarterly because we want to set a standard. You can't just do it every year and do it 6 months later. It takes too long to find out what's happening. So if you have suggestions for us, or if you have questions about how to do this yourself, please don't hesitate to contact me. We'd love to help other people take a very aggressive stance in fighting the surveillance state.
Thank you. So I don't know how tight we are on time. I don't see a volunteer in the room who can tell us. I knew we got started a little bit late, and I want to leave lots of room for questions because this is supposed to be a interactive format. It's 3 o'clock. Sorry?
You're speaking until 3:15.
No, what was that?
1:05.
We have 15 minutes. Do you want to open it up for questions right away from the audience? Are there questions from the audience? One question I have from the audience is how useful transparency reports are to your work and why. Sure.
Well, they would be a lot more useful if they were published in a structured data format. I think with the exception of Google, and even Google could do much more, much faster in that sense. But almost every single other transparency report is published as free-form text on a website. This is really not helpful for others to analyze and basically to comparative analyses of various other transparency reports, to be able to place the transparency data in the context of other information sources. So please, please, please start publishing in a structured format, please. And the faster, the better.
I know that there are folks who want to respond to that, but I saw another hand on the other side of the room.
Well, just another question. So it sounds like there's a lot of evolution, let's say, in the transparency reporting business. I'm just kind of wondering whether or not your organizations are looking to collaboration towards setting some sort of standard in terms of the transparency reports. It sounds like each of you is almost challenging the norm here, but could there be some cross-learning and some standard setting that's done within the industry on this point?
Let's take that.
I mean, I'll maybe start and get the ball rolling. I mean, these are both related challenges. I mean, we have seen Google put out its data in a structured format. We've seen XLS data coming from Microsoft. But then again, even if we get everyone putting their data out in a structured way, if they're all using different definitions and categorizing everything differently, it's going to be much...
That's fine. It's just slightly more work to go through. But seriously, it's going to be fine. The data standardization in this sense, it really would be nice and shiny, lovely, but please start publishing in the structured fashion first.
I mean, I second
anyone
that.
who's interested in structuring can do that really, really fairly simply, fairly simply.
Well, I just want to say that, to what Kevin was saying, there are certainly examples of big, sort of complicated transparency reports, which have a lot of very useful information in them. But when you look across the 18 companies that have done it, actually the vast majority of them are fairly small and simple. And so, while it might be useful to have data, structured data format, particularly for the larger companies, for the smaller ones, it would be very easy just to like hand code. So I have to side with, or not really side, but I have to second what Kevin was saying, that I think the real issue is how do we get the transparency reports to actually use more of the same terminology, and that's something that we are working on. We've had conversations with most of the companies that are up here, and we're going to continue those conversations over the coming weeks and months. So hopefully that will be coming. Hopefully.
I just want to flag that this thing, the memo that we released today includes this chart, which is basically our attempt to map how all the different reports are defining all the different types of requests, if they are even reporting them. And you start to see commonalities, and right now that Verizon has issued FISA numbers, Google and Verizon at this point are the clear best practice in terms of actually clearly categorizing and defining the most granular categories of types of legal process. That is not as granular as what Credo did, but I'm not sure what Credo did with scale for Google and Verizon.
They could totally do it.
But I mean, and the next step for us after this memo is going to be, we pulled together all the different ways all the different companies define these things, coming up with standard definitions that maybe they will follow, maybe they won't, but perhaps new entrants can all start using. And so we could have maybe a set of definitions that are endorsed by like Berkman and OTI and other groups that like startups could say, oh, there's a starter kit. Those are the definitions and categories I use. That's certainly our hope at this point.
Any response from companies? I mean, we're people, not companies.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just having a set of best practices for what the floor is for transparency reporting would be really good. I don't know where that's coming from. Getting music with this.
It's getting wistful.
Yeah, this is great. I think having what are the best practices? What is the floor? Like what should be in a transparency report? And then if people want to go further and further, if it's every single request, every agency down to the agent's name who issued the request and the judge who signed it. If you want to go that granular, more power to you. Knock yourself out. But I think if civil society and companies can agree on what the floor is, I think that'd be a really good start, at least, to this problem.
A bunch of questions from the audience. Maybe we can start.
I have two questions. One is on that matrix. I don't see the request for subscriber data. For instance, there are times that the police see a certain entry on the blog and wants to know who put that blog on. So wants to know the name and address for the author of the blog entry. But
so there are two different ways you can categorize the requests, and actually I think the best practice is to do it both of these ways. One is to break it down by the type of legal process it is. Like, is it a subpoena? Is it a court order? Is it a wiretap? And several of these different pieces of paper could be used to get that kind of basic subscriber information. For example, a subpoena or a 2703D order or a search warrant. All of those could be used to get that kind of data. But so,
In the United States.
in the United States.
Yeah, he might be talking about outside the United States.
Well, which leads to my second question slash was when you standardize the data sets, you should come up with a transnational definitions, not the definitions that just fall nicely under the U.S. laws. So content, subscriber data, pen register I don't know any transnational definition that fits pen register data. So that would be my request slash question. My question would be why the subscriber information is not set aside.
I mean, so as I was saying, this chart describes the different types, the way that people are categorizing and defining the different types of legal requests, like what authority it's under, what type of request it is. I think you can also, and I think companies should also, break out the requests they get by how many are for the content of communications, how many are for transactional records, and how many are for identifying information like what you're discussing. And in fact, I think when it comes to trying to deal with international requests, I mean, this report right now focuses on US law because we are seeing an emerging best practice on how people categorize the US requests. It does get harder when you want to come up with a generalizable definition that works across the world, but one way you can do that is by focusing on the type of data requested, and I think that is a good way to go.
To that end, I think that there are a couple sessions throughout the conference that are going to actually focus on the obligations of companies in jurisdictions that are not their home jurisdiction. So I would encourage you to attend those.
Just wondering if someone could speak a little bit more about the cost of dropping the case before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Seems there's a lot of talk on how these transparency reports are good, and I think there's a lot of criticism out there that they benefit the companies more than they do the public. And so I'm just wondering if someone could talk a little bit about why it was wise to drop the case before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and what are we not gaining from going down that route?
I guess that's addressed to me. So I think from our perspective, I think we've always been really clear that we wanted to be able to report on precise figures, and we still do want to be able to do that. We've been involved in trying to negotiate with the Department of Justice for a very long time now, starting with the national security letters all the way through FISA requests. And I think, and I wasn't directly involved in negotiations, but my sense was that among the companies who were involved in those negotiations, we just got to a point where we didn't know if we were going to get anything at all. And at that point, I think we all spoke together and we debated against each other and just came to the conclusion that, something is better than nothing at all at this point. At Google, we have a philosophy, you guys all know this, but launching and iterating. So if you looked at our early reports, they were just, whatever we could pull together as fast as we possibly can and get it published, and then we're going to work on getting it more granular. I think in this case, our thought was, we're disappointed that we weren't able to get more, but we're hopeful that Congress will be able to pass legislation that will allow us to report more. I think we had just felt like we had reached like a kind of an impetus in the court process, and so we wanted to move over to a different avenue and push our focus there. That's not to say, though, that we don't reserve the right to bring another court case. We did do that when we spoke to the Department of Justice.
So I'd like to say something. I think that's a really good question. And at Credo, we disagree. We don't actually think that Congress is ever going to address this issue. They haven't addressed the abuses of the Patriot Act yet, and there's no chance for any of the current, legislation really that would just even address the bulk collection dragnet. There's very little chance that that'll be through. So, despite the fact that our president is a constitutional law scholar, he has presided over an incredible escalation of the national security state and warrantless wiretapping on Americans accused of no crimes. And we really believe it's up to the courts. So the courts, I think that's probably the only avenue by which we're going to see constitutional rights restored in response to these issues. And so we think that it's really important to aggressively prosecute these cases in the courts. And it's not just up to the big guys to do this, the little guys can do this too. And we also have lawyer advocates at EFF and the ACLU, the Center for Constitutional Rights, who can be lead lawyers in fighting these cases. And I would say that that the responsibility as companies to us, because the most egregious of these violations of constitutional rights come with the kinds of court orders from the FISA Amendments Act and Patriot Act that include a gag order that doesn't allow companies to tell their customers that this information is being handed over. So the customer has no avenue to challenge these requests if wrongly accused or not really accused of anything in court. They can't challenge it. So it's really, really incumbent upon us as companies, right? If we're the only, because if the NSA and government entities have to come to our companies in order to get this user information and the users can't be told, we are the only ones that can stand up for our customers' privacy in court because they can't even be told. So I do think all of those of you who have a role as advocates or work in a company to advocate for an aggressive posture in terms, even if you don't see it as a political stand, if you see it as a stand on behalf of your customers, I urge you to think about this seriously and to take a stand. And if you need help, if you feel like you can't afford it, go to the ACLU, go to EFF, go to the Center for Constitutional Rights and ask them how they can help you.
I actually just want to ask a question before we go back to the audience in terms of that. I mean, the ACLU, they gave are great resources if you want to challenge something. If you want to actually put together a transparency report, what is the investment from your perspective from a small company? And I actually asked the question of all of you. I heard from Ali that it took about a year of planning to put together a transparency report for Tumblr and 12 people. Now, Tumblr is a large company with lots of users, but you're also a relatively small company in terms of headcount compared to some of the other folks represented here. I mean, what across the panel, I know it varies tremendously, but for a really small company, this is transparency reporting for beginners. What's the minimum sort of investment that we're actually looking at?
We had a series of conference calls with our in-house counsel and a couple people from EFF, and they gave us really great advice on what would be the best transparency report out there, and we followed their advice, and that was free.
And how long did it take?
2 weeks.
Most of the legal analysis for our transparency report was in-house. Ari and I, Ari's the general counsel, we probably spent 10, 20, 30 hours discussing the issues, and then we trained our trust and safety team to handle, analyze, organize the 462 requests that came in over the course of the year. That was just an ongoing commitment, a couple of hours every week. Through the entire fiscal year 2013 or calendar year 2013. Once we got all the data in, I'd say it was probably 20 or 30 more hours of quality control, doing the analysis, figuring out what the statistics were and what we wanted to report on, and then probably another 20 or 30 hours of design, writing copy. So it was a pretty substantial commitment for a 2-lawyer, 10 trust and safety team legal department. But again, it was doable. It wasn't easy, but it was doable, and we thought it was worth it in the end.
Yeah, so our process was that we had someone on our legal operations team and then a lawyer at Dropbox spent a lot of time on this, maybe a month or two prior to publishing, and then there were some review cycles, and we had to get engineering and design resources, which is always very precious too. I can't give a number of hours total, but probably somewhere between 50 and 100 person hours working on that report and figuring out exactly how we want to categorize things and then putting it in a way that's digestible for people would be my guess. I think at our scale, we don't have a ton of these, so it's very,
I imagine it's quite a lot for Google.
It's just, I think back when we did it, 4 years ago, it was just, at that point that hadn't been done, so there was a lot of retrofitting in terms of how to track information and learn how to parse it for the first time and do it in a way that was meaningful. So. Don't really remember, to be honest with you, but yeah, it was a significant effort and it was very manual, and it still is, to be honest.
I mean, just a tip that I've learned from talking to a lot of the companies that have done this, two things. First, I would say that one thing you can just do is read through all of the existing transparency reports. Think about the kind of data that if you were to do a transparency report in the future, you would need to include in that, and then just start keeping track of it. Think of, so as the reports come in, just do a very careful job of keeping track of it so that when the time comes that you decide that you do want to release a report, sort of the huge investment of going back and reviewing what could be a large amount of requests, just that work has already been done. And then once you think about actually creating the report, I don't want to speak for the people on the stage, but I think a lot of the companies would be very happy to talk to other companies that are thinking about doing this. So if you pick up a call, pick up the phone, or email and say, hey, we're thinking about doing this. My instinct is that most of the companies that have been doing reports would be eager to share what they've been doing.
I'll also volunteer Ryan, he knows this really well.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd also just echo a point that Ryan's making, which is any company should be logging this information anyway, just as a matter of best practice and good compliance, and knowing what you're doing and how you're responding to things and systematizing that. And so, focus on doing that, and the transparency report part should come fairly easily after that.
So I know we're close to the end, but there are three more questions in the audience. Sorry.
Hi. So I work for an NGO called Paradox, and we do capacity building work. So introducing new tools and systems to human rights NGOs. One major aspect of that work is getting NGOs access to tools that would be cheap, preferably free, for them to use. And a lot of these, a lot of the tools that you already produce, Dropbox, a lot of the Google apps and whatnot, Tumblr, also are very valuable tools for NGOs because they're easy to use, they're accessible, and they're free. On the other hand, we often sometimes have a sort of moral conflict because we can't assure them that the data that they put into these systems aren't going to end up in the wrong hands. So I have two concerns there. One is how detailed or how granular is the information in your transparency reports about requests from foreign governments, and how open would you be to maybe interacting with human rights organizations if they were to approach you to find out if information that they may be storing may have been accessed by the U.S. government, for example. If they're working on litigation cases in Palestine, for example, how can they be sure that the information that they have about someone is not being shared with the Israeli government, and then through the U.S. government with the Israeli government? So this is what I'd like to add to that.
Did you guys feel comfortable? Were you able to hear the question?
Well, we report and have since the beginning all the requests we received from other governments outside the U.S. as well. I mean, that was the beginning. That was our point, I think, in releasing the report, is we wanted to provide a worldwide perspective. In terms of protecting users' information from either getting snooped or from government requests, there's two things. I think the first is that we are, especially since the Snowden revelations, really speeding up encryption across all of our services and links, really working hard on the technical side, and our security engineers are top-notch when it comes to being experts in encryption. And so we've encrypted Gmail since 2010. Most of our services, when you're signed in, are all encrypted so that no one can snoop on you if you're using an open network or something like that. And so we think the technical side of that is extremely important. The other side of it is, I think, the work we're doing on reforming government surveillance and legal reform and making sure that there are specific standards that governments have to have in order to get access to information. It's really important to us, and we're obviously fighting requests that are overly broad in the courts. The example that we often use in 2006 when the US government asked us for more than 2 months worth of user search queries, and we actually went to court against that and won the case, and didn't have to turn that information over. So we're constantly fighting those cases. If an NGO were to come to us, I'd have to know it on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, always interested to chat, for sure.
The last question.
I was wondering whether the companies track how effective their transparency reports are. So there's one element of design, but there's another element of how the companies publicize it. I think I've seen some variation amongst companies in, some companies send employees to conferences to talk about their transparency reporting practices. Like some companies will really eschew the issue when asked about it. People tweet, blog, but I think that there's a big difference amongst companies. And I was wondering if you could talk about whether and how you keep track of how many people transparency reports reach.
Well, I can say briefly, we did issue our transparency report in a series of
blog posts that could be reblogged, or users could leave notes, and we had very clear numbers about how many people were directly interacting with each of our blog posts. I also, we issued a post on our staff blog announcing the release of the transparency report, and we got thousands of notes on that staff blog post. So we don't know exactly how many people viewed the transparency report and maybe they were just passing by and didn't leave a note, but we do know and have solid numbers about how many people gave our report a heart or a reblog. So there was some positive feedback. We also have an ask box in our transparency report where people can submit questions to us, and I personally monitor the ask box, and we get a lot of great, very interesting questions about the report and people speculating about maybe other information that hasn't been released in the report, but it just shows that people were engaged and clearly reading our report carefully, which is exactly what we wanted.
Do you plan on using any of those questions for frequently asked questions or reporting them in any kind of way?
So it's possible. I mean, there are privacy issues involved because we answer the questions privately when they're posted, but it's a good idea.
Anybody else get a heart on their transparency reports?
Well, we blogged about it, we tweeted. I'd love to look at the raw numbers on page hits for that, for /transparency. I haven't looked at that number, but I'm going to go back to the office this afternoon and look. And maybe that'll be part of our next transparency report, is how effective we are communicating this to our users.
You should publish your report on Tumblr and then look at it on.
That's a good idea. We actually emailed our transparency report out to about 3.5 million people that are on the Credo email list. So, and not only do we get it to all customers, but we want to make sure as many people as possible knew about it. And we also did press around it. I think it's important for people to put press releases out, and so that it actually gets analyzed and talked about in the meeting.
I have one last question if we have time, which I think we may. We have 2 more minutes. If there's no more questions from the audience, where do you guys see the next innovations in transparency reporting come from? So I spoke to our legal counsel who focuses on this for access, and he said, you know, I'd love to see things on internal policies around information requests being published. I'd love to see things on data retention policies being published as part of transparency. How long it is that you store data after data has been deleted or accounts have been closed. Any sort of thoughts on where that might come from? And maybe I'll start with Ryan, because has a little bit of a removed position on this.
So as I said in my beginning comments, I think that one of the hardest parts about transparency reporting has been how do you use the numbers to tell a story? And I think it does get to the question that you were asking about the sort of internal processes. And so one of the things that I think there's a great opportunity for being more transparent and providing really what would be very helpful information to end users would be knowing the kinds of processes and thought processes that companies go through in deciding what to do with the demands that they get. But it ends up being much trickier than you might think to try to first do that in a way that's like catchy and that like has things that people would read because no one wants to read a 400-page manual on how we process a subpoena, but also to do it in a way that then doesn't give the path for governments to say, hey, this is great, we now know why you declined Brazil's request and didn't decline, Spain's request, and now we know the secret, and we're going to follow that every time. And so I think that's tricky, but there's a lot of very creative, wonderful people who are working on these things, and so I think that's one area.
Just briefly, I think increased transparency on national security requests. It's the obvious one. There's so much room for improvement there, and that data is tremendously valuable to the extent that we're debating where the line should be drawn between civil liberties, privacy, and national security. There's so much upside potential in that particular area. Obviously, it's a tough fight, but our friends at Google and Facebook have great lawyers who are involved.
I think the that probably the fastest big innovation is going to be someone's going to make a big mistake. So I think the only thing that's really going to be like a leap forward in this is someone will make a mistake and publish something that they're not supposed to based on a process, and that's the most interesting thing over the next couple of years. So I'll be excited for whoever messes up and then puts something out there that really changes the debate. So I'm hoping for that.
So we published the percentage of a number of requests for which we've given notice. I want to see that more standardized. I would hope every company does that. Just how many requests we received, how many times we gave notice for each request. I mean, that's really meaningful for users.
Yeah, we're going to be constantly expanding the diversity of the number of reports we have, so keep an eye out for that. We're constantly thinking of things that we can do to help inform users about how governments affect their information or their general, what affects their free flow of information online. So we're thinking along those terms. I would also say, on the user data request side, national security requests are a big thing for us. We definitely are concerned about being able to report the different types of legal process under FISA, as well as the number of user data facts. So that's something we're going to be working on, working towards, as well as just increasing the granularity of our reporting. I think now that you guys are all doing reports, it's really great because you just learn from each other and challenge each other. And it's a great race to the top, I would say, with all of us.
Well, thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us. For the rest of the comments, I guess we have some mistakes to look forward to in transparency reporting. Great, have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.